$200 or €300 more for the Pro. Is it worth it? Let's find out. When choosing between two smartphones in the middle and upper price range, I would normally recommend the average user. Take the cheaper one. You get 95% of the features for a much lower price. For the latest features and maximum performance, you usually have to pay an excessive price. Most users neither need the maximum performance, nor do they use all the features. Unfortunately, in my opinion, this does not apply to the iPhone 14 and the 14 Pro. Yesterday, Apple introduced the two new iPhones, and I would recommend most people to go for the iPhone 14 Pro. Of course, this also applies to the iPhone 14 Plus and the Pro Max. In fact, if you want to save some money, I would go for the iPhone 13 Pro rather than the iPhone 14. You might ask yourself, how can you make such a recommendation if you haven't had the chance to test the new iPhones extensively? The reason lies mainly in the cameras, and you will soon understand why I can recommend the Pro model even without an extensive test. But let's take a quick look at how the iPhone 14 Pro or Pro Max differs from the regular model. The iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max feature an interesting design change. Unlike the standard model, they no longer have a notch, but instead of the notch, a pill-shaped cutout that houses the Face ID sensors and a new front-facing camera. The aim of the change is apparently that a larger part of the display can now be used. Especially with the smaller Pro model, I think that this change hardly brings any advantages. It may look better, but the additional benefit seems to be rather small. But Apple wouldn't be Apple if they hadn't developed an interesting feature out of an actual weakness. Dynamic Island was actually the biggest surprise at yesterday's presentation. The field around the pill-shaped cutout changes dynamically to show you important hints and activities. Of course, at first glance, this is more of a gimmick, but it just looks cool. Apart from that, the Pro has already differed from the regular iPhone in a number of other design elements. Not only is it available in different colors, it also uses different materials. Whether the colors and the design of the Pro now look significantly better is of course a matter of taste and does not play such a decisive role for me today. The Pro models even have a decisive disadvantage in terms of design. The camera bump of the Pro models is significantly bigger than that of the standard models. This was already the case with the 13 Pro, and I've got used to it by now. But when I held the 13 Pro in my hand for the first time, I was a bit shocked at how big the camera bump is. And that brings us to the biggest and most important difference for me. The cameras. The iPhone 14 Pro and the Pro Max have three cameras. A camera with an ultra-wide lens, the main camera with the wide standard lens, and a camera with the telephoto lens. In contrast, the iPhone 14 and the 14 Plus only have an ultra-wide camera and the main camera with the wide lens. The camera with the telephoto lens is therefore missing. Now many will say, that's not a problem. I don't need a telephoto lens on my smartphone. If I want to get closer, I just zoom in. Or I just move a bit closer. However, such a statement is probably based on a somewhat incorrect understanding of what optical effects the focal length of a lens has. It is not a good idea to digitally zoom in on a 12 megapixel sensor, because this leads to a clearly visible reduction in image quality. And if you just go closer, it doesn't give the same results as a higher optical focal length. The higher focal length of a telephoto lens leads to much less distortion. The background looks closer, it is more compressed. Especially the lower distortions lead to much better results when shooting people, especially portraits. So just look at this comparison for example. In addition, the main lens of the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus has a relatively wide focal length of 26mm. This leads to a lot of flexibility, especially when shooting video. But 26mm already creates visible distortions. Faces and bodies are stretched out. We have already become accustomed to stretched faces and bodies on our Instagram accounts. But of course it doesn't look ideal. So that's why I think the telephoto lens is more valuable than you might think. And if you've had it in the past but haven't used it much, I would recommend you use it more, because I believe that shots of people and faces are among the most common subjects of photos taken with smartphone cameras. And we haven't even talked about the new high-resolution 48 megapixel sensor of the 14 Pro and Pro Max. This is limited to the wide main camera. The ultra-wide camera and the telephoto lens still have 12 megapixels. Interestingly, the main camera not only has more megapixels, but also wider focal length. Instead of 26mm as with the 14 and 14 Plus, it is now 24mm. That is already clear in the wide angle range. The reason is clear. The high-resolution sensor now allows digital cropping without much loss of quality. Apple therefore offers a 2x zoom on the main camera, while still producing 12 megapixel photos. In general, the main camera continues to produce photos with 12 megapixels and not with 48 megapixels in the standard shooting mode. If you want a photo with 48 megapixels, perhaps to print it out in large format, you have to take the photo in ProRAW. Why then a sensor with 48 megapixels? It is a quad pixel sensor. This means that 4 pixels are bundled especially in low light conditions. 48 divided by 4 is 12 megapixels. The result is an image that has less noise in low light than with a conventional sensor. In good lighting conditions, the information of the 48 megapixel sensor should in any case lead to sharper results and more details. How well the new sensor actually performs in low light compared to the 12 megapixel sensor of the main camera of the iPhone 14 remains to be seen. But the fact is that there are other differences between the cameras of the iPhone 14 and the 14 Pro. The cameras of the 14 Pro and the Pro Max not only have different sensors, but also different lenses than the ultra-wide and wide cameras of the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus. The ultra-wide camera of the 14 Pro has a larger aperture than that of the iPhone 14. The larger aperture makes it possible for more light to reach the sensor. As you can imagine, this allows for better performance in low light. Absurdly, this is not the case for the main camera. Its aperture is even smaller than that of the regular iPhone 14. The differences in aperture are not huge, and you have to see what impact they will actually have in practice. What the ultra-wide camera of the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus still cannot do is macro photography. This is still reserved for the Pro model, and macro shots certainly lead to cool results. There are hardly any differences in the video features. All new iPhones support the new action mode, and finally 4K recordings in cinematic mode. Okay, so $200 or 300 euros just for an extra telephoto camera, 48 megapixels, better low light performance and the macro mode? That sounds like a lot. Even though, as I said, I think the telephoto camera adds quite a lot of value in everyday life if you use it properly. But there are other differences. Only the Pro models have the better and brighter ProMotion display with 120Hz technology. I'm still holding the iPhone 13 Pro here, which also features a 120Hz ProMotion display. The year before I had the iPhone 12. And yes, it's true that the ProMotion display is of course better, but the display of the iPhone 14 is also certainly excellent. And already the display of my old iPhone 12 was so responsive and so good that the real advantage in everyday life of the 120Hz ProMotion display is rather small. But the display of the Pro model now also has an always-on feature. Personally, I think this is a successful innovation. You will no longer have to pick up your iPhone to see what time it is, or even whether you have received a message or whether you have an appointment coming up. The display of the iPhone 14 Pro also has a clearly higher peak brightness, which leads to advantages especially outdoors and makes the reproduction of the HDR recordings even more realistic. The additional power consumption of the display is compensated for by a stronger battery. And then only the iPhone 14 Pro has received the new A16 chip, while the iPhone 14 continues to work with a somewhat optimized version of the A15. Of course, this can also be a selling point, because it makes the Pro more future-proof and it will perhaps be fast and more responsive for a longer time. In summary, however, I'm of the opinion that the telephoto camera is an extremely important distinguishing feature. For this reason alone, I would always go for the Pro model if the budget allows it. Add to that the design elements, the better cameras, the better display and the faster chip, and it seems to me that the iPhone 14 Pro or Pro Max represents the better deal. So what's your opinion? Give me a like as feedback if the video was interesting for you. There will be in-depth reviews and tutorials for the iPhone 14 and 14 Pro. So stay tuned and see you next time.